Awesome. Well, we can go ahead and get started. Yeah, thank you, Ben, for joining and giving a seminar. I'll just go ahead and hand it off to you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. So I recognize some of the people on the call, but not necessarily everyone. So my name is Ben Murray. I'm a professor of atmospheric science here in the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. And I've spent several years now working on atmospheric ice nucleated particles. Um, so in this talk, I'm going to present some of our more recent work. So this is really now focused on, uh, actually, it's entirely focused on unpublished results. So things that we actually are you've either just submitted or about to submit. So it's a good point to give us some feedback. Some of what I'm going to show you is perhaps a bit controversial, so I'm going to be quite intrigued to hear what people have to say. Um, so So this talk is going to be focused around the types of aerosol particles uh, that drive the ice particle production in shallow, high latitude mixed phase clouds. Um, so cloud systems like this. So I think you guys can see my cursor. Excellent. Um, So cloud systems like this. So this is a colder outbreak cloud system, which is forming in air streaming out of the high latitudes from these ice cover surfaces in the north, out over a warmer ocean. And you see that the air is essentially clear or cloud free over the ice. And then as soon as it gets over the warmer sea, the cloud promptly starts forming. So initially that cloud is this stratus cloud, and then it later on breaks up into more cumulative character cloud. So these clouds, they're close to the surface, but they're supercooled, and they can be quite deeply supercooled. And they're generally mixed phase. And one of the reasons we've focused on these clouds in recent years is because because we understand the history of those clouds. We know roughly how old they are. We know the synoptic flow. We know that they form liquid first, and then the ice starts forming in them as you come downstream. So unlike other types of mixed phase clouds, which are still important and interesting, we have a really good idea of the history of these clouds, and I guess we've argued that they're a bit like a natural laboratory where we can explore processes and try to understand these ice production processes. So, um, so one of the reasons we're interested in clouds is because they cover a very large portion of the planet. And I think that this is a famous photograph taken by one of the Apollo astronauts, and it's known as the I'm just going to put my pointer on. It'd be better. Um, it's known as the blue marble image, or images like this that also are called the blue marble. And I think the thing that strikes me about this cloud, this picture, is that actually it's quite how white the planet is. You know, the certainly from this angle, looking on the South Pole here and the Southern Ocean, a large proportion of the planet, a large part of that ocean is covered in these clouds. And that's interesting because these clouds are um, the properties of these clouds and the albedo of these clouds is so dependent upon their microphysical properties. And ice formation and the formation of ice and the subsequent microphysical changes in clouds is really is quite substantial. So this is a this sequence of images at the top, this cartoon at the top, illustrates the importance of ice nucleating particles, the particles that initiate ice formation in clouds. So first of all, ice nucleating particles are rare in comparison to cloud condensation nuclei. Only a small fraction of cloud droplets therefore contain anything that'll heterogeneously nucleate ice. So if you have a supercool cloud with just a few ice, where just a few ice crystals form, those few ice crystals have the potential to grow at the expense of the supercool droplets. and then dramatically shift the hydrometeor size distribution from a cloud of many, many small droplets to just a few big ice crystals, which can then precipitate away. And you see this effect beautifully in these so-called hole punch clouds. This is caused by an aircraft going through a supercooled cloud layer, initiating ice. But you can see the effect of the ice formation, that this stuff in the middle that's falling away these are the ice crystals leaving behind essentially clear air behind it. So, making a hole punch in that cloud. It's red because the sun is low and you've got either sunrise or sunset. And you can also see this effect. This is now from above. This is from, I think this is from a paper in 1949. I should have put the citations in here. I'm sorry. But this is from Bernie Vonnegut and Kurt and Langmuir's work, where they dumped ice nucleating agents out into this supercooled cloud layer, and you can see it's just removed this part of this supercooled cloud layer, essentially exposing the darker surface underneath. So our modeling also shows that clouds are sensitive to the amount of ice in them. So if you have many ice crystals, so this versus few ice crystals for a cloud system that's forming over the Southern Ocean. So just to give you a perspective, there's the Antarctic Peninsula, there's Antarctica, and the air's streaming up here off as in a colder outbreak scenario like this, up. So it's going north. And you see this quite a dramatic difference in the albedo of these two different clouds, depending on the amount of ice that you allow to be produced in these clouds. And this is important because in part because it's important for our current climate, but it's also extremely important for feedbacks, for the cloud phase feedback, so cloud feedbacks in general, but specifically the cloud phase feedback. So when the Earth warms, the ocean surface temperature will warm with a certain input of CO2 into the atmosphere. And when the sea surface warms, the isotherms will shift upwards, and all else being equal, the liquid will replace ice. And those clouds would become more reflective as you increase the amount of liquid in them and decrease the amount of ice in them. And as the clouds become more reflective, i.e. their albedo increases, so they then exert a stronger cooling effect. And that represents a negative feedback on the planet's climate. So, this cloud phase feedback counteracts or buffers the effect of the CO2. But the strength of that feedback depends, in part, on the amount of ice in the clouds right now. If there's lots of ice in clouds now, this negative feedback could be stronger. If there's very little ice in clouds now, then this feedback will be a lot less negative, which then results in you haven't got such a strong buffer. So for a given amount of CO2, we would then expect more warming. And then, unfortunately, it looks like many of our models have been putting too much ice into clouds like this, these mixed phase clouds. So this is a plot now, a little old, so 2016. From I think quite a seminal piece of work where Tan et al. Showed that when they went from a state with relatively small amounts of supercooled water to states with cloud or model systems, or where the supercooled water was probably more realistic. Like, for example, I think this orange bar was where it was tuned to fit satellite measurements. You see that the amount of warming for a doubling of CO2 increases by about a degree and a half or so. Just from changing the amount of ice versus liquid water in clouds to be more realistic. And more recently, people have shown similar things. So, for example, Hoffer showed that just by tuning the amount of ice in the interior versus water in the interior of clouds to try to be more realistic, they actually produced an extra Kelvin of warming by 2100. And this is, this sort of sensitivity is substantial. But at the moment, none of these models are actually linking, most of these models, I should say, are not linking the amount of ice in these clouds to the concentration of ice nucleating particles or necessarily even the or other ice production processes. So certainly in Tan et al., they just tuned the amount of supercooled water and ice in order to try to get a better fit to now. Whereas ideally we would link that amount of ice to the physical processes producing ice in the first place. So, so what does control the ice particle concentration in the cloud? And really, I think there's two schools of thought on what controls the ice particle number concentration. And so I think you get a different story when you talk to different communities. So some of my colleagues over in Manchester, for example, are they will argue, we have some debates, that secondary ice production is it tends to dominate the ice crystal concentration and rapidly overwhelms the ice nucleating particle or the primary ice produced by ice nucleating particles, sort of rendering the initial concentration of INP kind of irrelevant. The other school of thought that we've expressed, and certainly in our modeling, like that Vergara Temprado study that I referred back to a few slides ago, suggests that, well, we suggest that, well, primary ice production is absolutely first order for dictating the ice nucleating the ice concentration in clouds. So which one is it? So one of the things we wanted to do is try to understand which of these processes is driving ice production in mixed phase clouds. So just to refine that question. So what we try to do, what I'm going to talk about in this seminar is then what is that relationship between IMPs and the ice concentration in clouds? And along the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our potential instrument biases or technique biases that we have. And then I'm going to talk about mainly focus on Northern Hemisphere colder outbreaks, but also referring to the Southern Hemisphere, where these ice nucleating particles come from. So just to make sure the acronyms are defined here. So CAOs are cold air outbreaks. That's that situation where you've got the air streaming out of the high latitudes, forming cloud out over the ocean. So to answer the first of those questions, that relationship between the IMP and the ice crystal concentrations in clouds. What we did in 2022 was conduct two major month-long field campaigns using the FAM aircraft. I'll show you some more pictures of FAM in a bit, but it's this aircraft. And where we focused on these colder outbreak, natural laboratory type clouds, where the air is streaming out from the ice-covered surfaces in the north. We focused on the northern hemisphere. And then these clouds start forming. They're initially stratus, and then they break up into cumulus. But we flew below the clouds, above the clouds, upstream of the clouds, and in the clouds. So we're able to characterize the aerosols. So we could measure the IMP concentration spectra, the aerosol size distributions, some idea of the aerosol composition, thermodynamic structure of the atmosphere, and what have you. And then we could fly in the clouds by doing a combination of sawtooth profiles and straight and levels through the clouds in order to characterize the ice crystal concentrations in the clouds, the cloud droplet concentrations, the structure of the clouds, the dynamics of those clouds. So these flights were really quite an experience. So we took the UK's FAM aircraft. So this is the Facility for Airborne Atmospheric Measurements. It's essentially a flying laboratory. It's a very nice facility to have. This is an image on the inside of the aircraft. See the cockpit up the front there with the various instrumentation and the control uh, uh, stations situated along here. The mission scientist, so sits up front. So this is when I was mission scientist on one of the flights. You sit up front between the pilots and you dictate all everything that's that interaction between the pilots and where to fly and coordinate with the scientists in the back. We saw some fantastic scenery. So this is up near Svalbard, and there's this was at Longyearbyen where we had to refuel, and yeah, so you can see some of the underwing probes there above my head. So these underwing probes are used for measuring the aerosol size distributions and also the cloud microphysical properties. So the two campaigns we did, one was called ACAO, and that was done in March, mainly in March, flying from Kiruna, flying north up towards Svalbard, sometimes refueling in Svalbard and then sampling these cold air outbreak cloud systems that form in the sea north of Scandinavia. We managed to get 11 flights in total in cold air outbreak. Sorry, 11 flights in total, but 8 cold air outbreak cases. And then in October 2022, we then had a month based in Goose Bay in Canada, where we flew out into the Labrador Sea, sampling these colder outbreak systems that then stream down the Labrador Sea. This was one of the nicest examples that we had. So there we managed to get 12 cold air outbreak flights. And we actually, yeah, it was mainly in October, but going into November as well. So the design of this is that we would try to fly upwind and then downwind, and you can kind of get an idea of what it was like when you look out of the plane window. So this is now just this video on the bottom left is this is where we're upstream. You see how it's nice and smooth. We're just gliding along. The sea ice out of the window is beautiful. I think we may be at a few hundred feet here above the sea ice. And then further downstream, now I have to come out of to get rid of the pointer options in order to play it. So now this is now downstream. Now the convective clouds have started forming. There's turbulence. The plane is bouncing around. There's wind has picked up. You see out of the window there, the waves are going, are really picking up. We're struggling to hold. This is actually Stephen Abel. He was struggling to hold the camera still. And you really get an idea. You also get an idea of how low we can fly on the FAM aircraft. We've got some very, very good pilots. So we can actually we bottom out at about 50 feet, which feels very low when the waves are tens of feet high. So let's get my laser pointer back. Ooh. Okay, so in order to sample aerosol and ice nucleating particles, what we do is use these filter inlets. So these are the inlets on the outside of the fuselage of the aircraft. This is where we strapped a HEPA filter onto the front just to put some blank tests. But we can then the air comes into the body of the aircraft and then comes into these filter holders. So the filters there, you can see it here, and you can see the body of the filters. That goes on to that part there. So you collect your aerosol onto the filters. Then we bring those filters back to a laboratory that we have out in the field. I'll show you some pictures or a video of that in a moment. And we use the microliter NIPI experiment, cold stage experiment, where we place an array of droplets directly on top of the filter. So this is directly on top of a Teflon filter. And as they cool, you go from none frozen to some frozen to all frozen. And that fraction frozen, so a single freezing event indicates that there's an ice nucleating particle active at that temperature present underneath that droplet. And that then allows you to determine the IMP concentration spectra. So here's a video of the of a hotel laboratory that we set up in New Mexico in this instance, but we had very similar laboratories then set up in both in Goose Bay and in out in Kiruna. Our motivation for doing the analysis in the field and actually as soon as we can after sampling, so usually within hours, sometimes within a couple of days, is that we we worry about bringing the samples back to Leeds and if they might change on the way during storage. The other motivation, which is perhaps the more important one, is that we often find that there are sources of contamination in our process. So by doing the experiments live and specifically the handling blanks live, we can, or as live as possible, we can then deal with those contamination sources and keep it all under control. So I'm going to play this video and let me tell you about our lab in New Mexico. Hi, I thought I'd do a video to show you our lab. And can you hear the volume? Okay, it's
It's
quiet.
okay. Yeah, the volume is okay. Maybe just turn up the speaker
Okay,
a little bit.
here we
Yeah.
go. Our isolating particle lab that we've set up out in New Mexico as part of a DC MEX. So we're out flying on the FAM aircraft, and then we're bringing our samples back here to analyze. So I'm just going to show you around. So this is all set up in a hotel room. Um, so our cold stage is here, so we can put an array of droplets on top of that cold stage. I think you've got to admire our improvised lighting setup with a strip light bought from Macy's over the road. Is the assay is underway. None of the droplets are frozen yet, so I've got two separate samples on there, split by that red line. Might be quite a few minutes before they freeze. But you can prepare all our filters and all the bits and pieces in this clean hood where I've got filtered air. We've got our air purifier systems to keep the air really clean as possible. And then in here, we've got all of our cleaning stuff. So we've got compressed air, which we feed through HEPA filters to supply airflows for cleaning and also for the instruments. Sonic baths, heat plates for the heat tests. So we can do biological tests for proteinaceous biological particles. And there's the cleaning station here. So you can see I'm halfway through the samples or the filter holders that we use on the ground-based site at the Langley lab. So yeah, I think we've made good use of this hotel room. Okay, bye. Okay. Hi, I thought I'd do a video. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we do that out in the field. So yeah, we got lots of jokes about Breaking Bad and that sort of thing. Setting up labs, but like it's amazing that the hotels just, we explain what we're doing, we tell them what we're doing, just as long as we don't damage anything, they really don't mind. Is our experience. So anyway, these are the resulting isonucleating particle concentrations from ACAO in green and M phase in orange. So you've got and then a contrast here. I've put in some IMP concentration spectra from Socrates, from the Yavanen paper, and then also from the SOC. So this is the Southern Ocean Cloud Campaign, which was run by the British Antarctic Survey. So these are ground-based measurements. So which are actually quite similar to the Socrates measurements. So you see this contrast, this northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere contrast, which is really striking. And I will come back to this in a bit. But really, the IMP concentrations that we recorded in ACAO and M phase really are a lot greater than they're reported for the Southern Ocean. So the other part of this puzzle, so we've got the IMP concentrations, we have multiple IMP spectra per flight. So then we need to know the ice crystal concentrations. So the primary instrument we've used for measuring ice concentrations in ACAO and M phase is the 2DS. So this is a 2D instrument which takes images of the ice crystals as they pass by these cameras. It's positioned on the outside of an aircraft. So this on this image is under the from Paul Lawson's paper. It's on the main body of the fuselage of an aircraft. Ours is out under a wing. But the sort of images you get are like this. These some beautiful six-fold symmetry ice crystals, and they're in stereo, so that gives you a little bit more information. But the key thing here is that we can distinguish the ice crystals from cloud droplets on the basis of size, primarily, as well as shape, size and shape, sorry. Um, and Therefore, we can count the number of ice crystals. So this gives us a count of the ice crystal concentration. So now we can contrast the ice crystal concentrations that we find in these clouds with the IMP concentrations. So the IMP concentration spectra are in blue. The ice concentrations are now in red. And we've plotted the box and whisker diagrams. So the vertical line in the middle of the box is the median. And then the triangle is the median including zeros. So you see that there actually are quite a lot of measurements without any ice being observed. So the ice concentrations are patchy in these clouds. So and we've plotted it here as a function of the cloud temperature. So this is therefore these are the ice concentrations that correspond to a temperature in the cloud. And you see there's some relationship here, and then it's sort of, but we've still got ice crystals forming down here. We've still got ice crystals of relatively high concentrations right down here, as we're approaching 0 degrees centigrade. So is that real? That's probably related to mixing in the clouds and precipitation. So we can think about what's happening inside a cloud. So one hypothesis might be that you're generating most of the ice at the top of the cloud, where it's coldest. But that ice is going to be mixed on quite a rapid sort of minute type time scale within a cloud because of these clouds are relatively turbulent. And so that ice is going to get mixed throughout the cloud. So what we've also done is taken the same data, but plotted the ice concentrations now as a function of the cloud top temperature. So now these red points are now pinned to the temperature vertically above the cloud at the top of the boundary layer. So now you see there's almost a one-to-one correlation now between our IMP concentrations and the ice concentrations with some scatter. But that's pretty neat. But when we go to M phase, we see just a different story. So we see this, the clouds were a bit warmer in M phase, but we see this, the ice concentrations at the local temperatures often greatly exceeded the IMP concentrations. And then even when we translate that into the cloud top temperatures, it's forming essentially what looks like pretty much a vertical line. What we think is happening here is that in these clouds are straddling the Hallett-Mossop regime, this -3 to -8 degrees centigrade, whereas very few of the clouds in ACAO actually went into that Hallett-Mossop regime. So we think that most of the ice production, a lot of the ice production is actually occurring low down in the cloud, and that's then getting mixed upwards in the cloud. Hence, you got this sort of, it's almost like a vertical mixing ratio straight upwards, constant mixing ratio straight with altitude. So we're seeing evidence of both primary and secondary ice production here. You're also seeing these strong excursions to very high concentration locally in certain pockets of clouds. So now we've plotted this data in a slightly different way. So we've plotted the IMP concentration, or the median IMP concentration, and the median ice concentration. So individual flights are in the slightly translucent points in the background, and then we've got a average values for the two campaigns sort of binned into temperatures. So ACAO is triangles, M phase is circles. And now you see that, even though in M phase that we could see that we think there was quite a lot of secondary production taking place, there's it's the IMP. The IMP is there's still a relationship between the isonucleated particle concentration and the total ice concentration. That red line is just the linear fit to that, and we've also folded in data from the Southern Ocean campaigns that we had available from Socrates and SOC. So the one-to-one line would be here, or is here. So there is a tendency to have slightly higher higher values of ice concentration than the IMP. But the general messages here are the more IMP, the more ice. And I think that's actually the first time anyone's actually experimentally, observationally shown this. But there's complexity in there. The concentration of ice particles is often greater than the concentration of IMP, and I think so that I think that is evidence for other ice production processes, i.e., secondary ice production. And our colleagues in Manchester, I actually have a paper sat on my desk that I need to read from Michael Biggart, where we've gone into which secondary ice production processes we think are most important. But I think this is striking. If you go back into the older literature, very often the IMP concentrations were guessed, and then an ice crystal enhancement was taken. The other thing that I think to notice in some of the older literature is that people really focused on the peak concentrations that they saw anywhere in a cloud. And if we plot our M phase and ACAO data according to that criterion, so we just plot the maximum ice concentration anywhere in the clouds that we observed, we essentially lose any relationship to the median IMP concentration. So then there's no relationship between those peak concentrations observed and the IMP. So that once the SIP processes or secondary ice production processes take hold, SIP then controls the ice number concentration. But that's only happening in pockets of the cloud. So I think both camps are right, but really the situation I think, as most of us would have probably predicted, is more complex. But I think this is the sort of data where we can actually really get into this. So one final slide on this topic is I've contrasted the ice concentration as with a temperature on the y-axis for these 4 different campaigns. I just wanted to really emphasize this, that the red and orange are for the Northern Hemisphere campaigns, the blues are for the Southern Hemisphere campaigns. And there really is this difference between the two hemispheres. I think, in the Northern Hemisphere, there's just more ice crystals, even though you're in the similar temperature range, and in very many cases, actually really quite similar cloud droplet number concentrations. So there's really this hemispheric difference in the ice concentration, which we think has been driven by the different hemispheric differences in the IMP concentration. I think it's worth noting that many climate models don't have that connection to aerosol. Therefore, you just don't have this hemispheric difference. And we can't just assume all clouds are the same everywhere in the world. We need to link the ice production to the IMPs and SIP once we understand the processes. Right. I've spent longer on that than I intended to, so I'll see how far I get now and leave some time for questions. So now, one thing to note is that our isonucleated particle concentrations were rather high in ACAO and M phase relative to other high latitude measurements. So here it's just a compilation of results. So in green, we've got the ACAO. In the orange color, I've got M phase, and then a whole load of other campaigns in the background. Right. So, they're broadly in the same range, and you can see that with Hypervex's data here, if you were to carry that on, it would sort of fits quite nicely with that sort of trend. Um, but we are very much at the upper end of this range. So why is that? So partly it might be exactly when we flew and where we flew, but also I think so. One question is, where did these IMP come from? But there's also potentially an issue with the different techniques. So I'm going to now go into just a few slides on the different filter-based techniques that are used used in the literature or used by the community. So there's two techniques. So I've already described to you what we refer to as the drop-on method. So this is, I think we're fairly unique in doing this. This was initially developed by Russ Schnell, and we took the method from some of his papers and then developed it further. So this is where we take a Teflon filter, so a hydrophobic filter, and then we put the particles directly on top of that filter and cool them down. And we've argued that it's a more direct way of accessing the IMP. It also has the advantage that it's more efficient with the particles. So we actually include more of the particles in a droplet freezing assay if you use similar sized droplets. And then there's the wash-off method, where you take the filter, you put it into a volume of water, and you somehow agitate it, sonicate it, do something to it to try to recover those particles into liquid, then pipette that water out into an array, and then cool them down. And that obviously requires being able to recover the particles from the filter very efficiently, effectively. And I've included here just a set of side-by-side runs from the FAM aircraft filters, which was published by Alberto Sanchez Marroquin a few years ago. So in blue, we've got the Teflon, and the red, we've got the polycarbonate. And because we've got two filters, two inlets on the FAM aircraft, we could collect these two filter types in parallel. So we're sampling the same air at the same time. For the same amount of time. So, and you can see in some cases, the agreement between the two techniques is excellent. No problems at all. And then in other cases, you see this, the polycarbonate is often lower than the Teflon, especially at the higher temperatures. And this is only there's more examples in Alberto's paper. So we put this in the SI just to be open and transparent, and decided, let's keep an eye on what's happening here. And then we've seen it again, and we've seen it again. Like sometimes there's agreements, sometimes there's not agreements, but it's usually in the same direction. It's usually in the direction that the polycarbonate is lower than the Teflon, or almost exclusively. So Joe Robinson, a PhD student here in Leeds, has been doing some really nice experiments then to explore this. So what we've done is we've launched well-defined, well-characterized aerosol particles into our aerosol chamber. We can measure the size distribution of that aerosol. We can sample it into our pine chamber, and we can sample it onto different filter types. So, and then we can take those two different filters, one polycarbonate for the wash-off technique, one Teflon for the drop-on technique. We take those two filters and analyze them appropriately and promptly after the experiments. So for something like mineral dust, so this is an Alaskan Copper River dust that we happen to have, which is, it's a mineral dust, which is mixed with a bit of biogenic stuff. Then the agreement between the wash-off in blue and the drop-on in red is pretty good. It's not identical when you look into details, but it's we're reasonably happy with that, given the uncertainties. It also agrees with the black points in the background are based on cascade impactor work we did, where the samples were collected out in the field directly from the air, and then also the green points pine measurements, which we made in a separate set of experiments as well. So, but when we've normalized to the surface area, everything there is agreeing very, very nicely. However, if we take SNOMAX And specifically when we take Snowmax, where we've made a suspension of Snowmax, and then pass that suspension through a filter, a 0.2 micron filter. So now we just have the mainly have the macromolecules, the small stuff, and then nebulize that into our aerosol chamber. Then we see a massive difference between the different techniques. So the black points are for pine, the red curves are the Teflon drop-on technique, and the blue are for the wash-off technique. So the wash-off technique is reporting, freezing at much lower temperatures. We're just not seeing all of these IMP that the other techniques are seeing or reporting. So so one hypothesis there would be that these proteins, these macromolecules from Snowmax are getting stuck on the filter. So what we did is we took those filters, we washed them, and then we took little 1 mil biopsy punches out of the filter, then put those biopsy punches into a 96 well plate and used our large format droplet freezing assay to look at this. And that's where the IMP are. So the clean filters that have not been exposed to aerosol particles activate these 1 mil punches of these filters activate down here. So the background's pretty awful. However, if they've had the Snowmax suspension on them, they're nucleating ice around -6. So the proteins haven't come off the filters. So in light of this, we decided to take a look. Oh, my animations haven't worked. Whoops. We decided to take a look at this the difference between the polycarbonate and the Teflon, and the drop-on and wash-off techniques out in the Southern Ocean. So Mark Tarn joined the Sir David Attenborough. This is our new British research ship. So this is the British Antarctic Survey. So you might have heard about this in the news. The British Antarctic Survey had a public engagement thing, and they asked the British people, oh, what should we call the boat? And they just left it open to everyone. And the winning the people then voted on other people's suggestions. The winning suggestion was Boaty McBoatface. So they decided not to use the name, but one of the lifeboats on the side, or one of the small boats, I think it might be that tender there, is Boaty McBoatface. But the ship was actually called, it has been named Sir David Attenborough in honor of one of our national treasures. So the cruise went down to the Antarctic Peninsula. We had our Leeds ice pod on board up on the foredeck. So this is then positioned right up here on the foredeck. We had it inside it. We had the pine. We have filters out on the deck, so we can do the comparison between polycarbonate and Teflon, and SMPS, APS, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. So, and this is an example where we had the drop-on technique with filters that were sampling at exactly the same time as the wash-off technique, the polycarbonate technique, and we're seeing this a really similar thing again. This strong difference. Down here, I've just put then a composite of all of the wash-off versus drop-on and pine measurements all together on a plot. So this is really preliminary, but you start to get an idea. The drop-on technique is generally reporting more IMP at the higher temperatures than the wash-off technique. I don't think we can say from the pine data which one is more consistent. Be careful about these points in here. The counting statistics on pine are terrible at these high temperatures. So I wouldn't, well, we've got to think about how to show that data in its more sensible manner. Just to put that in perspective, though, so if I just translate that curve and sketch it onto the plot I showed you a minute ago, the IMP concentrations in the Southern Ocean are still very, very low, but they're not quite as low as I think some of the contemporary polycarbonate measurements have indicated. So, I was now going to spend another 10 or 15 minutes talking about where the IMP come from. So I'm going to skip through some of this. We had a question. Our question was whether the IMP are coming from local sources or distant sources. I'm just going to skip on and just say that our conclusion is that the IMP in the certainly in the northern hemisphere, Arctic, are in ACAO are not from local sources. So we think that the IMP are from a old aerosol that was emitted potentially months earlier from low latitude sources and is mixed down and entrained into these colder outbreaks. But in order to save some or have some time for questions, I'm just going to skip through to the summary here. Um, big take-home message is, well, more IMP leads to more ice particles. That's one of these ones where I think, half of the community are going to be like, well, yeah, yeah, of course. Are you surprised? The other half of the community are going to say, well, no, SIP controls ice. But I think it is both, which, I think most people actually, I think always realize, but actually having the quantitative evidence behind that is important. But that secondary ice, secondary ice production processes, it enhances the ice concentration in pockets of the cloud. And I think that's important. It introduces a heterogeneity in the cloud rather than being uniform, whereas the IMP are producing more of a uniform concentration of ice crystals across the cloud, dictated by the cloud temperature. So generally, though, there are more ice particles in the northern hemisphere clouds than the southern hemisphere clouds we've looked at. And we think this is related to the IMP abundance. So more IMP in the northern hemisphere generally than in the southern hemisphere. So hence the natural conclusion from that is that we have to, in our models, link that ice production to IMP. And that is being done in some models, but lots it's not. So I think there's evidence for a lower bias in the IMP concentrations when we use these with the wash-off polycarbonate technique, where we're losing certain types of ice nucleating entity on those filters. And then and we think, and this is a bit I didn't really get time to talk about, but we think it's dust that's emitted from low latitude deserts months prior to sampling or ingestion into a cloud is an important IMP type. So we think it's this accumulation mode dust, these small dust particles that have a very, very long lifetime. And think about months and months lifetime, many months lifetime rather than days or weeks. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for that really nice talk. Yeah, I was just at a conference last week and it sparked a lot of questions for me about secondary ice production. So selfishly, this was a really, really good talk for me. Yeah, if we have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or um, type some questions in the chat and we can read them out loud. Yeah, we have few minutes for questions. I did have one question. I guess I can start it off. In that slide, kind of towards the beginning, I can't remember the slide number, but it was the slide where you're comparing the ice crystal concentration to the IMP concentration, and for the mixed phase clouds. Um, and kind of one of your conclusions on that was in the mixed phase clouds, like on the bottom two plots. Oh, no, no, go back a couple more. Yes, that one. Um, so I guess why do you think that IMPs are activating lower in the cloud for plots C and D? I guess like because I know that ice crystal concentration is higher at these lower temperatures, but I mean, I would have thought maybe ice production or IMPs were activating higher up and then they were kind of like subsiding. Yeah.
So that's the picture that we get in ACAO.
Okay.
So that definitely is definitely that the data is consistent with production of ice in the top of the cloud, which is then getting mixed downwards through the cloud,
Mhm.
so that it's the cloud top temperature which is defining how much ice is in those clouds. Whereas in M phase, the picture was less clear, and we think that's because we think our explanation for that is that it crosses this Hallett-Mossop regime. So the Hallett-Mossop regime is this strong secondary ice production regime. This is, so this ice splintering regime, which empirically is observed in field data um, and some laboratory data, which and specifically seems to happen between -3 and -8, peaks at -5, and so what we're proposing in many of these clouds is that you've got some ice production from primary ice, but it's just enough ice production to then trigger this secondary production in the -3 to -8 regime, and then that ice is getting mixed upwards through the cloud. So we end up with these two different scenarios. One where the ice is getting generated at the top of the cloud and getting mixed down, and one where the ice is dominantly getting produced low down in the cloud and getting mixed upwards. And it depends whether you cross into that Hallett-Mossop regime.
Okay. Thank you. And I think Jessie has her hand raised.
Hey Ben, thanks for the nice talk. Can you go back to your SNOMAX and dust from the chamber experiments? I'm kind of surprised your SNOMAX spectra looks like that.
Yeah.
Can you, I may have missed this, but what is your wash off technique? Like, how are you actually washing off the filters? Because I'm really surprised you're not seeing what a typical SNOMAX spectrum would look like,
So
even on the polycarb.
we've got the right plots here. So there's a distinction here, and I didn't put all the figures in to really tell the full story. So this is specifically for filtered SNOMAX suspension.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where we've taken the SNOMAX and we filtered it. So we've taken out all of the cell fragments and the bigger stuff and
Mm-hmm.
big aggregates and what have you. If we do the same experiment, but where we dry disperse the SNOMAX powder, then we get agreement between the two. We get agreement between the polycarbonate and Teflon. In fact, there's another
Still,
figure
I'm still,
to put in.
I'm still surprised. So, like, what is your wash off technique though? Are
The
you
wash-off technique.
rotating it or
Yeah.
sonicating or?
Rotating, but then also we tried various methods of shaking it vigorously. We tried sonicating to various degrees, and the filter disintegrated before it released the IMP.
Yeah, you have to be careful how long you sonicate for the polycarbs.
Yeah, because we tried to really hit it hard in
Yeah,
order to release stuff, but we ended up destroying the filter before we ever saw it
yeah.
release the IMP.
And you said these are both 0.2s for the Teflon and the polycarb?
Oh, sorry. I'd have to go and check with Joe the actual specifications. I think the no, no. The filters is zero point 0.4 on the polycarb, and it's I think 1.0 or 1.2 on the Teflon.
I,
The
hmm.
Teflon.
Do you think that has something to do with it using different pore sizes? Because the collection efficiency varies depending on the pore size for
Not
different
much.
filter types.
Not much. So we would we were guided by the literature on this about which pore size to choose because we wanted to maximize the flow rates in the aircraft sampling because we need the sensitivity.
Right, yeah.
We have very limited amount of time to sample. So we wanted to go to the maximum pore sizes we were happy with. So we used essentially the literature, but then compared with our results with smaller pore size results as well. But yeah, I mean, what there's a little dip in the accumulation mode where you don't necessarily where there's like some of the you miss some of the particles, but it's like a 10% below unity.
I mean, it depends. It does
The
depend on the
smaller,
pore size. Like if you do the like Spurny and Lodge calculations, I mean, it does depend on the pore size. Like sometimes you can have a pretty big dip. I don't remember for these exact pore sizes. It also depends on, the filter thickness and everything. Um, yeah,
yeah.
I'm just
Well, yeah,
wondering.
yeah, because we relied on yeah, people have done the characterization experiments. There's some references in some of the papers where we've done this. But the yeah, for the filters we've used, it's a really small effect. So they
Yeah.
really pick up the particles right through the full size range. So the small end it's diffusional losses, and the big end is impaction. And the two curves come together. So the key is not to let those two things come apart, and then you lose the ones in the middle. But nevertheless, I mean, it's the Teflon is it's the Teflon filter with the drop-on technique where we've got the bigger pore size, so you'd expect the losses to be bigger for the Teflon.
Depending.
The
I'd
thickness, the
have to
thickness
see
is different.
the loss calculate, like the transmission efficiency calculation.
Mm.
Um, I mean, for this one, you said you pre-filtered. Sorry, I'm hogging this. For this one, you said you pre-filtered the Snowmax solution. What size did you filter the solution
That was
to?
zero point 0.2
Point two.
microns.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we nebulize that. So it's an aqueous suspension which we nebulize with
Yeah.
a sonicator.
I wonder if that has something to do with it because I know for point fours you do lose around 150 nanometers. It's a pretty decent
Yeah.
loss for that size.
But you've got to remember that these two results. I mean, this is the same aerosol, like the sampling in the two.
Yeah, yeah, I know,
So
but
you've been
you
through
can
the
have
same
a larger
process.
loss around 150
Mm.
for the point four. Anyway, yeah, we could talk offline, but I'm curious to see the results of this. I'm definitely interested because,
Uh,
so many people use the polycarb method.
Well, including us.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yes, it is a concern, and
Mhm.
so it's this style of experiment. But we need to translate this data into, like, I think got to try to get it onto the other plots. But the we've looked at other materials as well. So we've looked at a number of different soil dusts. We've looked at filtered soils, where we just try to look at the macromolecules from soil. We've looked at pollen, cellulose, maybe some other things there as well as the bulk Snowmax, dry suspension. And much of this material, in many cases, most cases, the two curves for the drop on and wash off are much closer together, right? But there's still a discrepancy. And then when we look at the what's left behind on the filters, we often find that there's still actually quite a lot of material left behind, even when the two other curves actually match up. So if you think about it, it's like, even if the other two curves match up in terms of an NS, match up within a factor of two or so, like in these curves here, you see there's a bit of a bias low in some of these blue curves.
Mhm.
And when we look at the polycarbonate filters with the punch, there's still actually quite a lot of signal left behind on those polycarbonate filters. So what seems to happen is that, and there's something I'm going to put in here, was like Joe's put a cartoon together. We think if the big chunks of material, like mineral dust particles on the order of microns, chunks of cell wall on the order of microns, they get washed off readily. It's the small bits that get left behind. And we've
Yeah,
checked it
yeah.
first. We've looked into our filters in the wash-off technique and with electron microscopy. But electron microscopy is not very good at finding small organic particles on an organic substrate.
Right, yeah, yeah,
It's very good at spotting the mineral dust particles, and we think the mineral dust particles come off. And we showed that they come off.
yeah, yeah. It's a tricky question. It's hard to chemically analyze because of the carbon background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just one silly kind of question or more so of like a clarification. The drop-on method, are you analyzing like contact nucleation and then the wash-off is immersion, or are they both? Because that could
Um,
be
we've
different.
argued that they're both immersion.
Okay.
Um, but obviously the particles are actually sitting at an interface.
Mm.
That is also somewhat true in the drop-on the wash-off technique. If you've got larger particles in your wash-off technique, they sink to the bottom and settle onto the surface. So you necessarily have the particles sitting at an interface again. So this is so, which I think is is another issue, potential issue. I've not seen any evidence that it is actually a problem, that there is any enhanced or reduced activity for those particles sitting at the substrate liquid interface.
Mm.
I guess that's where Nadine's work would come in. Her group's kind of doing some of that,
Yeah, yeah,
interfacial versus in drop
yeah,
freezing
certainly.
work. Yeah. Huh.
Yes. And so actually something would suggest that there is something there, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the challenges in our ice nucleation field.
Well, Ben, if you have time, there was one question in the chat from,
I can stick around, yeah.
okay, yeah, there was one question in the chat from Santiago.
Ah,
Uh,
okay. I didn't talk about high-latitude tests at all, did I? So I can't quite get the chance. Uh, could you tell me the question, actually?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Wasn't sure if you were looking for it. He said,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the claim that long-range dust emitted months ago may have a role in IMP production. I wonder if background observations of aerosols support this. Do you see presence of dust in the background? And if so, is this both Arctic and Southern Ocean or Antarctica?
Um, yeah. So these are these are composition measurements that we made with the electron microscopy on on the polycarbonate filters. Um, so cytosol composition. So the from ACAO, we had problems with our instruments and
Mm.
knowing things, so we only managed to do a handful of them. But the this group of colors, so this orange and this sort of dirty yellow color, these are different. These are various types of mineral samples. So there's clearly quite a lot of mineral dust in these samples. So it looks like this material, this material that was sampling at altitude in one of those cases is rich in mineral dust. It's really not obvious where it would come from on the surface at that time of year because everything really was snow covered. You saw those beautiful snowscapes around on Svalbard. Um, but also that altitude profile you saw, or very briefly saw, the concentrations of the ice nucleated particles are greater higher up than they are lower down. This implies that there's a sink at the surface, not a source at the surface. That's at least what that would be consistent with.
Mm.
So, and then when you look at the back trajectories, there's certainly no single source that jumps out. I think the back trajectories are more consistent with this aerosol is just it is in the air. It's there, and it's been put there before the 7-day back trajectory has started. It arrived there. So we know that there are transport routes, very efficient transport routes for aerosol into the Arctic, and that's what Arctic haze is. We've kind of connected Arctic haze with pollution, but really that soot pollution and what have you, that anthropogenic component of it, is kind of a tracer in a sense for transport. It's telling you that there are transport pathways from places that are produced where soot is being produced, i.e., lower latitudes. So this polar dome comes right in the wintertime, comes right down to the Asian deserts. So then there's a direct pathway then for aerosol to be transported into the central Arctic. And also the modeling shows that certainly the Asian dust is important, but also that dust from Africa that's lifted to really, into the mid-troposphere up to like 5-7 kilometers, dry. It's dry convection lifting it. There's no water, And once it's at 5, 7 kilometers, you're already relatively cold, and that can then get transported in. The challenge of aerosol emitted from the UK is that it's relatively warm and wet. So then you've always any air that's uplifted from here or transported in some way into the Arctic has to pass through rain and cloud, and then it's not clear how that aerosol would survive into that part of into the high Arctic. Whereas from those other cold environments or those dry, hot environments, I think it can be transported. I want to go and talk to Steve Arnold, who gave me this figure actually, about that dry, like, why there's so much desert dust gets into the Arctic.
Yeah.
I think that's just amazing. But yeah, so and then this is the stuff I didn't get to show is just how old a lot of the dust ice nucleating particles are according to our unified model. But he studied old accumulation mode particles. So old meaning in this case more than 60 days old. It's accounted for most of the ice nucleating particles in a model where we're representing dust and marine sources of ice nucleating particles. So at the higher latitudes, certain times of the year, it's really dominant. And that's I think, quite a revelation. So the community of really, I think the dust community, atmospheric community, you think, what's the lifetime of dust in the atmosphere? And you look at the textbook and it says, oh, like a week or something, a few days a week. And that's the mass or the optical scattering effect. The big particles do drop out in that time scale. But in terms of INP, that many of the INP are in the accumulation mode. They're not necessarily contributing that much to the mass or that much to the optical properties. Um, so those small dust particles can define the INP concentration, and those dust particles could have been emitted many months earlier.
That's really interesting. We're about 10 past the hour. If anyone has any more questions, feel free. I did have one more question, but I don't know. It's kind of I don't know if you have time.
Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I kind of was thinking about, I guess, like, well, secondary ice production, and I guess is there some sort of parameterization or like equation saying like, okay, if we have this many IMPs at this temperature, and I guess in this equation there would be like an updraft velocity, and because that seems to play a huge role into it. So I don't know if there already is something like that, or if
So they wouldn't tend to relate it to existing ice, not necessarily to the IMP, but like there's so like yes, there are equations. So so there are equations which empirical equations people have come up with, say, how many ice crystals you generate from ice-ice collisions. So then it depends on the concentration of ice.
Mm.
Um, there's the Hallett-Mossop Rime splintering process, which depends on the presence of the big ground core particles. So and how fast those particles are falling, and you need to then have the other conditions correct. So you need a population of large droplets and a population of small droplets, and you need so hence the rate of splinter production depends on a number of factors, and then it's scaled to the temperature so that it reproduces this laboratory data
Mm.
from the 1970s.
But
Interestingly,
that's more so coming from the observed ice crystals, not so much the IMPs, correct?
yeah.
Okay. Would that be
I
something that's
just,
possible?
oh, sorry.
Um, I'm not sure you'd necessarily, because I
Like for
guess,
models, because in the beginning
yeah,
of the talk you talked a lot about models and
yeah.
like mixed phase cloud models. And like, if we have enough observations of seasonal trends in IMP concentrations
Yeah.
in this region, I guess like, yeah, I mean, given the updraft velocity and the mixing in the cloud, like I wonder if
Hmm.
there's some kind of parameterization that could.
Um, I think it, I guess I don't think there'd be a simple equation which just relates the IMP concentration to a final ice concentration dip, because
Mhm.
I think it depends on other processes. It depends on the nature of the cloud and yeah, as you say, the updraft speeds
Mhm.
and the collisions and I don't know, maybe you could come up with and fold everything in, but I guess that's where our models, the microphysical part of our models comes in, and I guess
Yeah.
that's where we get that from. Um, Having said that, I mean, the SIP processes are happening on, seem to be in pockets of cloud. One of the things I'd really like to try to characterize, and I'm not sure our data is quite right for it, but is how big those pockets are. But it
Mhm.
seems to be really patchy inside clouds. It's like hundreds of meters. You go through a few hundred meters and there's loads of ice. The next bit, there's no ice. And it's all subgrid. It's
Yeah.
sub model, big domain model grid, well below climate models. So how do you represent that? And you probably can't, and it's strongly non-linear as well. So it's sort of, there's ice in it there because those SIP processes are explosive. So they just, once
Mhm.
they take off in some non-linear way, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing in our results, I think, is that you know it's not a given that SIP processes will take off. You need enough ice in the first place, and that SIP multiplication is more likely if you have a higher IMP concentration.
Mhm.
Which I think,
I just wanted to mention Mingwei left a paper for you in the chat, Ben, that corroborates the hemispheric ice discrepancy.
yeah, yeah. There's a few. Yes. Okay. So what? Let's see. What have you?
It's a third URL paper. She left a link for you.
This is. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that was all in the chat,
Yeah.
that question wise.
Yeah. So, 14 flight campaigns. It also supports. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I should. I'll have a look at that one. I'm sure I've.
And I actually have to get going too, but thanks for the nice talk, Ben.
Hey, thank you.